Sorry, hold on one second. I'm gonna stand so that I can see everyone. Because, you're all beautiful. And also I don't ever get to see actual human beings. Sort of a hermit in my house. And now I get to see you. So, what I would like to do, because you will be forgiven if you haven't finished the book yet, is read a little bit and then tell you, is it even on? Yeah. Okay. And then tell you where it came from. And then maybe we'll open up a little early for questions, if that's all right, because I prefer to talk to people rather than just, like telling you what I think about the book. I'd rather you ask me questions. So I'll do just a tiny little reading from from the beginning, so that I don't have to set it up for you, because that's always the most complicated part. Let me see. All right, this is at the very beginning. All you need to know is you don't even need to know this. It's 1609 and 1610 in Jamestown in Wisconsin. So Jamestown, as you all know, because you're geniuses, was the first permanent English settlement in the United States. The moon hid itself behind the clouds. The wind spat in icy snow at angles. In the tall black wall of the palisade, through a slit too seeming thin for human passage, the girl climbed into the great and terrible wilderness. Over her face she wore a hood drawn low, and she was slight, both bony and childish small, but the famine had stripped her down, yet stark to root and string and fiber and seam. Even so starved and blinded by the dark, she was fit. She scrabbled upright, stumbled with her first step, nearly fell, but caught herself and began to run, going fast over the frozen ruts of her field and all the stalks of dead corn that had come up in the summer, already sooty and fruitless and splintered with blight. Swifter, girl, she told herself, and in their fear and anguish her life moved yet faster. These good boots the girl had stolen off the son of a gentleman, a stripling half her age but of equal size, who had died of the smallpox the night before, the rash of rust spreading over the starved bones. These leather gloves and the thick cloak the girl had stolen off her own mistress. She banished the thought of the woman still weeping upon her knees on the frozen ground in the courtyard inside that hellish place. With each step she drew away, everything there loosened its grip on the carpet. Yet there was a strange gleam upon the dark ground of the field ahead, and as she moved, she saw it was the undershirt of the soldier who a fortnight earlier had been caught worming his body slow from the horrors of the fort and toward the different horrors of the forest. He had made it halfway to the trees when, in silence, a shadow that had lain upon the ground grew upward, came clear at last as the fearsomest of the men of this country, the warrior 2 heads taller than the men of the fort, who made himself yet more terrible by wearing upon his shoulders outstretched a broad, dark mantle of turkey feathers. He had lifted with one hand the creeping, fearful soldier by his hair, and had with a knife cut a long, wet, red mouth into the man's throat. Then he dropped him to spill his heart's blood into the frozen earth, and there the dead man lay splayed ignoble. All this time he had lain unburied, for the soldiers of the settlement had become too weak and too cowardly in their hunger to fetch the body back. She had passed the dead man, and his reek had drawn itself out of her nostrils, and she was nearly to the woods when she stumbled again, for the thought of those 2 men gave rise to thoughts of other men who lurked perhaps in the woods, men out there hidden and waiting. And now as she peered before her into the dark of the forest, she saw a man crouching in ambush in ever deeper, blacker shadow of each tree. Perhaps a man with a knife, or an axe, or an arrow, and cold murder in his eye. She stopped her running for a breath, but she had no choice. She took her courage up again and she ran on. And as she ran, each imagined man in passing revealed himself to be mere shadow. Sometimes a book comes to you in vestigial form and you hold on to it in sort of the spinning galaxy behind your head for a little while. And this is what happened with this book. So I was in a doctor's office in, I think it was 2012 or 2013. And, it's kind of really gross in the doctor's office. You don't want to touch much. Right? And I was looking at all the magazines that had been well handled. And there was one that hadn't been. And so I picked it up. It was the Smithsonian magazine, which is actually a really great magazine. It's very informative. It's very lovely. So nerd being the nerd that I am, I loved reading this magazine. And I came upon this article about Jamestown in which something just blew my mind. It's like blew my hair back. And it was about how they had disinterred the bones of one of the people who died during the starving times, time when over 80% of the people who had come to Jamestown died of eggs and fluxes and malaria and violence and famine, of course. And they found evidence on her bone that she had been cannibalized, which was shocking, right? It's a shocking thing. And I carried this idea with me without knowing what to do with it, because I think that that's one of the beautiful things about accumulating a novel. It's just you carry these things around, and one day they come in contact with something else, and they start to bloom into an idea. And what happened next was, a few years later, I went back. I had this urge to reread Robinson Crusoe, which, if you haven't read it recently, it is bonkers. I love it so much. It's such an insanely interesting book, right? I mean, it's basically a cross section of the English brain at the time. Right. So Robinson Crusoe gets to this desert island, and there's no one, and there's nothing to do. And so what does he do? But he becomes the greatest capitalist on the island, right? He goes out and he takes his knife, and he splits a tree very painstakingly into planks, and he builds himself a table, right? And it takes him like 3 seasons to do this. And then, eventually Friday shows up on the island, and he enslaves the only person. Right? That is so British. Because it is, a lateral section of the brains of people of the time. And I was like, whoa, I can do this for America, right? I can sort of see the founding settler brain by making like a female Robinson Crusoe. Because the thing about Robinson Crusoe, other narratives like this frontier narrative, right? It's basically like a narrative about like coming to a place that Europeans are not necessarily, and then making it their own, right? A frontier narrative is that it's hyper masculine, right? The vast majority of them are hyper masculine. That said, in the United States of America, the very first narratives that were frontier narratives are actually early American captivity narratives by women, primarily by women. A lot of them were collected by men around them, like Increase Mather, a very famous preacher of the time, and his son Cotton Mather, who meddled in the Salem witch hunt and killed a lot of people. They would gather up a lot of these. They're almost like folk and fairy tales of early American settlers. And then this is about, on the frontier at the time, there were these clashes between the Christians and the Native Americans, and the Native Americans would often take some of the Christians and later ransom them for money, right? And so the most famous of these is Mary Rowlandson. So I don't know if you have read it recently. It's kind of an amazing document in and of itself, because it was actually, she is one of the first American writers, and she wrote this thing all by herself, and Increase Mather introduced it for a public, because a woman writing in public was ridiculous and foolish. It's like a pig writing in public at the time. So he had to introduce her into the world, and it is an amazing document. It's a really horrifying document, because it's all for the things, the grotesqueries that it sort of talks about, but also for the way that it was used. Because these narratives were used to justify genocide, right? To justify the Christian expansion into the New World. Almost to make it seem as though it was God-given for the colonists to do what they've done. So, this is not the first time text I've been used as propaganda. But it was a really powerful way to form a nascent national identity. So I had all these things in my head, and I was really excited to sort of try to take all of these elements and turn them inside out, because my theory about writing art or making art is that it's never to uphold the status quo, right? That's entertainment. Entertainment is wonderful if we just want to just let the status quo go, right? Like let it wash over us. Netflix exists for a reason, right? It's not challenging. It makes us feel good about ourselves. But art makes us feel uncomfortable. Art takes these givens, these ideas about the world that we have maybe internalized without actually examining, and makes us examine them. And that's what I'm trying to do with a lot of my work. And of course, it's up to the reader to tell me whether or not it's art. Don't tell me, because I'm going for. Okay. I think any artist that they're all right, that just shake up this to try to make something. So this book took a really long time. So I started it in 2016. And my beautiful friend Elliot's in the room, and I think she read it in about 2017. And I thought, like a draft. I read it in lots of drafts, and she had like an early draft. And I took it. I had this wonderful fellowship at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard, which is one of the greatest things I've ever done in my creative life, because I was supposed to work there. I had two wonderful research assistants who are Harvard undergrads. So like they were already type A in my notes. I didn't know how to use the library. It was like I should say, go fetch me this, and they come back with like boxes. It was really wonderful. But I also had the glory of just listening to my fellows unbelievably brilliant lecturers on things that they are so passionate about. So there were geologists, right? And there were sculptors, and there were historians of many stripes. The one person who sort of broke my brain, they were all really interesting. I actually really wanted to write a black hole novel at a certain point, because the physicists were so amazing. Right? Like so incredible about black holes. But the person who broke my brain was my friend, Dr. Katie Bush, who is at Notre Dame, and she is a scholar of medieval nuns, which I thought I was not interested in, right? And like, okay. I did, when I was in undergrad, I had this 2-term tutorial, because I don't like large groups. This is small, it's fine. And I asked all of my professors. I figured out that you could actually do one-on-one individual tutorials. That's what I did for the rest of my career. And I did these one-on-one tutorials with this one incredible professor who taught me ancien français. So we would do translation out of Middle French into English, which was so fun, right? And really delicious. It's delicious to dig into Middle French. And I, at the time, I was really, no, it's all good. It's happened to everyone.
Fix that it would
that
it wouldn't do that. I'm sorry.
So I had fallen in love in college with Marie de France, who is the first published female poet in the French language. She's amazing. She wrote these lay that are they're retellings of really old folk tales from Britain, and they're in poetry, right? But they're basically short stories in poetic form. They're wild, they're bonkers, they're about courtly love, which is already wild and bonkers. One of them is like a pure werewolf story, so it's like way ahead of its time. Incredible. So I fell in love with those, and then as Katie's up on the stage, she's also, I have to say, this is important. She's like 8 months pregnant, and she's like radiating gorgeousness and beauty, and like taking over the stage. She's talking about these medieval nuns, and she's so in love with them that I'm sitting in the audience and I'm crying, right? Because she's giving this impassioned speech about what she loves the most in the world. And as I'm sitting there, I'm remembering Marie de France and my absolute adoration of her, and almost like this is the only time in my creative of life that I'd been given a gift of a novel, but it was sort of dropped into my head whole, and I could see the scope of Matrix, which was my last novel. And so I was writing Vaster and Matrix at the same time.
Oh, wow.
And then, well, it gets more complicated. I realized that actually, right, so Matrix had to come first chronologically, but what I really wanted to do was tell a larger story about how we got to where we are in the in-between, right? How we became the people who are driving humanity over the cliff. And then I envisioned Matrix as the first stone skipping across the surface of the water, and the second was Vaster Wilds, so 12th century, then 1609, and there is a third book that I'm working on. But at the time, so I finished an early draft, and I'd written it up onto the computer, and I threw them all into the laps, all three of them at once, into the laps of my agent and editor, and ran away crying. And the first two, they're like, "These are great, let's publish them." And the third, they're like, "It didn't work." And I've been working on it ever since. But so really, like, so I call it a triptych because it's not a trilogy. It's a way of understanding, I guess, the role of religion in bringing us to where we are, the societal stages that we are born into, that we can push against and try to find the way that we're pushing against them, especially when it comes to women, and the human's relationship to nature as mediated through theology. And all of these things are sort of circulating through these three books. Now, if I don't finish the third one, it's a diptych. I will have said it's intentional. Letting myself off the hook. And it's also fine if I finish the third one in 20 years. That's still around. We're all still around. So, I was told to talk for a while, but I really just, I'm tired of my work. I've been on the road since last Monday. It's a long time. I guess you go fill up with dopamine by hugging my two grown children, 15 and 12 tomorrow. So, I know they're great. But so for tonight, if we want to have a conversation, I'm happy. And the first person to ask a question wins. I have to do this for Americans because we're so competitive.
Can you tell us anything about this book, just for the time period?
Yes, it's now. I can actually tell you a lot about it because I've actually given speeches that are online about it, unfortunately, but it's completely changed. It's now. And it has a name that I really love, and I hope that it gets to keep, but sometimes I don't have the right to decide it. The board itself tells me. Not my editor, I don't care about them. But I love her, but not about her voice, about the title. So I think right now it's called Doomeater. And it's from Martha Graham, the great dancer. It has this magnificent quote in her autobiography, Blood Memory. And I'm not going to do it justice because I've never been able to memorize, but I know exactly where it is on the page. But it's this quote about how the artist is overtaken by art, so that we chase it even though we know it's going to bring us a doom. We are doom eager. And she says that it's this ancient Icelandic word, but I have Icelandic friends. And I've asked them if this is actually a word, and they're like, they have this beautiful feathery accent, like they're speaking through feathers. And they're like, no, it's not a word. It's but it could be like something that maybe someone said once. Who knows? But what I really like about it is how in replication and folding, Martha Graham took something and made it her own. So it's a wild book. It's also haunted by Gerard Manley Hopkins, whom I love so much. Right, he's one of my favorites of all time. I don't know if you know his what are they called? They're terrible sonnets, and they're not terrible because they're terrible. They're terrible in terms of like awesome, right? They're really incredible sonnets. There's Carrying Comfort is the one that I think of all the time. In fact, Carrying Comfort has gotten me through some very dark nights by trying to remember the lines, but I can't remember them. So it's like really productive to like get there in bed and be like, oh, does it go? Lay your lie in them, right? But so he's hunting the book as well. And it's really complicated. It's set in Florida. But all of this can change. So who knows what it's going to look like if it actually ends up in the film. I'm still, no matter how many drafts I do, like I try to keep it open until the book itself tells me what it is. And it hasn't yet told me that. And it's the hardest thing for me is just to not be so frustrated that I kick it to the curb before it's ready. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
You like Florida.
Why do I live in Florida?
Well, one of your books is Florida, right
Yeah.
now, Florida again.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. Oh, well, I live in Florida.
Okay.
Yes, yeah. So I ask myself why I live in Florida every day. I've been here 17 years. So
Wow.
like it's longer than I've been anywhere else, actually. I think of myself as, you know, a New England New Yorker, but I'm not. I guess I'm Floridian now.
Sorry.
Yeah. So Florida is not, it's politicians, Florida people, right? And the people are so good. A lot of them, not all of them. Some of them are terrible. But a lot of them are really good. And there are a lot of people working really, really hard against the forces of evil and evil. The other thing about Florida is that it has the most astonishing natural world that I've ever known. So I live in the center of the state, where it's basically a swamp. It's a giant swamp. But we have something called Kings Prairie, which used to be a giant lake, but then the aquifer took all the water one night, which is kind of an amazing story in and of itself. And so now it's this vast prairie, and there are wild bison. There are these wild horses that are the descendants of the conquistadors' horses. There are more birds than almost anywhere else in the continental North America. So sandhill plains come down and they have a sound like washboards, right? Like a lot of people hitting a lot of washboards. So moving, right? It's a really moving place. Also, my favorite part of Florida is the springs. There are these springs that come up directly from the aquifer. It's about 72 degrees, so it's too cold for alligators. I mean, a lot of alligators, some alligators. And what you do is you rent or you have your own inner tube. And you start and you can just float down these rivers through these jungles full of all sorts of birds and turtles and all sorts of things. It's just the most blissful thing. I mean, and it's cold, right? I'm cold for Florida, 72 degrees. It's really, really wonderful and beautiful. So I love Florida and I hate it, right? At the same time. But I think that's good for writers. I think writers need to feel not comfortable. And ambivalence is really productive and beautiful, right? Ambivalence doesn't mean wishy-washy. Ambivalence means strong feelings in multiple directions pulling you all at once. So, you know, there are definitely writers in the room. We all work with this strong feeling, this ambivalence, to try to find the subjects that really dig deep into us, into our psyches. Yeah, that's why I work. Also, my kids are from there. Okay, so like I have to love it. Yeah. Although I
Good things have happened there.
there's so much. Yeah. Great. I love process questions. No, I love this, right? Because this is the central question in every work of fiction out there. How much plot to put into the world. I was trained on like 19th century fiction. So I was trained with a really strong love of and desire for plot that was then broken in college by eclecticism, right? Like things of mid-century, 20th century that changed my understanding of what fiction is and what it's going to do. So when I'm working, which is I have very Catholic taste in my reading. I'll read absolutely everything. But when I'm working, I don't care about plot at all for the first few years, right? That's not what I'm going for when I'm writing. And so I have to talk about my process because people got really mad at me on Twitter about it. They're really furious, and whatever. But everyone processes their own. I'm not telling anybody to do it this way, but this is just the way that I do it with my OCD, which is very real. But I write everything long for really long years and years, and I cannot read my own thinking, which is good. So the thing about reading computers is that it already looks finished when it's on the screen, and so I cannot change it. And so I end up working on the same paragraph for like a year, right? And I cannot move on. I can't even find the plot, right? Because there's no plot because there's one paragraph. So instead of doing that, I do everything on him. And I give myself for the first draft a really short amount of time to do it. So the first draft of Vaster was 1 month. I gave myself exactly 1 month after having done 6 months of research. 1 month. And then more research to figure out the things that I figured out that I didn't know. Right? And that those first drafts are deliberate methods because of my OCD, because I want to not like have anything finished at that point. I'm not looking for anything. I'm looking for a deliberate failure. Actually, I want to feel into the. So I'm writing. The characters' names change, like their personalities change. Sometimes their genders change. Right, like everything changes. It's all just a big swirly mess. I couldn't reread it even if I wanted to, because I had such egregious handwriting. Then at the end, I put it away, right? And I start over again. And the leap, right, between one and the next is the most powerful thing that happens to this whole process, because it's in the leap that you start to understand the things that were good in the first draft, and then you move them over to the next draft. But you also have a better understanding of fundamentals, right? Architecture, the understanding the way that each individual character interrelates on the page, eventually, and off the page too, because you've already experimented in seeing that moment I end up in the so all of it is just like basically it's like an architect making a lot of drawings, right, before actually sitting down and put things. That's what I do. And then over and over and over again, slightly more time between the drafts because I'm starting to really understand the book. Usually it's about halfway through when I start to get glimmers or intimations of plot. Of course, with this book, it was relatively straightforward, right? I knew she was leaving the settlement and kind of a patrician in the beginning, right? And then from then on, it was just like, and then, right? But other books are more complicated in terms of plot, where there's prolepsis and analysis, so things happening forward and back as well, and it becomes tangled. And in that case too, I don't get too stressed out about it, because I think if I'm going to what is interesting, that's the part of my right? And I got that lesson from reading this. Yeah. You're both not sleeping for 80 pages. And it was amazing. Right? It's groundbreaking and spectacular and so interesting. So I think, I think there are people who stress a lot about plot. And I'm bully for them, I'm happy for them. I don't stress at all about it, and eventually something will come out of it.
It's so interesting, like, where you draw the line, process, writing.
This is a great question. Actually, that's a beautiful question. Are you a historian by any chance? I do. Okay, wait, before I get there, I have to tell you, I was at the American Academy in Berlin. This is like the first 6 months of this year. And I gave this really impassioned defense of historical fiction, right? Because I hated it, and now I love it. And after, it's 45 minutes, one of my historian fellow fellows stood up and he said, well, why do you write historical fiction, right? And I was like, hey. So I think that, we would never do that. So history, when I'm writing, is the foundation, right? I mean, it is the thing that I'm trying to write things to, and to try to understand. But at the same time, I can't, in the drafting process, be able to do it. So there's an amazing American writer named Catherine Davis. I'm sure some of her ones are here. Magnificent. The Girl Who Traveled was one of ever written. But she wrote this one book called Versailles. And Versailles is astonishing. It's about Versailles, right? It's sort of like the ghost of Versailles. And she did so much historical research that it took years and years of her life. And then when she sat down to write, she put all of her notes away and she wrote from memory because she wanted to find the way through everything without having to be derailed by the history. And I learned from that, and that's what I do as well. Which means that sometimes there are not kind of things in the book that don't get caught by my fact checkers, and I'm really sorry. But other times it means that you can be a little bit playful, right? I mean, I think in some ways, so my last book, Matrix, I tried really hard to stick to as much historical truth as possible, but it was also a time of a radical myth and mythology. There weren't these things, right? You've got a lot of things from the archives that were personally cemented, right? Same with actually this book too. John Smith, everything he says is just a lie, right? In order to make himself look amazing. And it works, right? It's like all about him, how he looks amazing, and it's not necessarily true. So I think that I have a very deep love of an attraction to history. I need it. I love what historians do. I don't think too hard about it, but I go back afterwards and try to fix things if they're wrong. And I think the beautiful thing that historical fiction can do, that possibly academic fiction cannot do, is that it can slide into the reader's imagination. As if you pick up a book of history, you know what you're getting, right? And you're choosing it deliberately. But if you pick up a novel, I have gotten so many people excited about music, right? And they didn't think that they would be excited about mine. Yeah, so it's complicated. It's a complicated relationship. I'm a dilettante. I know nothing, but I know where to get it. Yeah.
One of the things that I've enjoyed about your books is the dialogue and relationships. And I'm wondering, in terms of process, how do you make sure that resonates or that makes sense? Or do you talk to a mirror, or do you ask a friend to come over? Because your dialogue, for me, is one of the beautiful things about writing.
That's really nice. I've never heard that. That's so nice. Thank you. So Charles Dickens did that. I don't know if you know that, but when he went in to speak in a character's voice, he would go to the mirror and put on different hats. He did that. And sometimes, Hilary Mantel too, when she's trying to write, she actually, when she was trying to write about Cromwell, she actually took two chairs and she put them side to side, and she waited until the ghost appeared, and she actually. I don't speak to ghosts. I mean, except for in the middle of the night when I see them. I think it's there is always a part of the process where you stop and you say the book aloud to yourself, right, in order to figure it out. The interesting thing is, dialogue in fiction sounds nothing like dialogue in real life, right? If you take yourself speaking to someone, you'll be just humiliated. This is why, as told to, interviews are my least favorite thing on the planet, because I always sound like an idiot, right? And I know I'm saying smart things, which is not coming across. Because the way that we speak is so different from the way that we read. So you have to actually take that and change it into a whole other language, actually, the literary language as opposed to language on the page to make verisimilitude not verity, right? That's what we're going for most of the fiction. Verisimilitude. Yeah, no, yeah, just say it out loud over and over again, and then say, oh, that's too like real life. There. Oh, great, Jane. Yeah.
After a while, there's really great, amazing description of hunger, and without food. Curious if you had any specific insights, research, or either help you write about not only when we get to hungry, but what happens.
We did a lot of research on what happens to the body under real duress. So this one of the other sparks of the book that I forgot to talk about, but now I'm doing it, is my sister actually. So this is the book that it's dedicated to her, and she is an extreme, like she's a long distance athlete. She was in 2 Olympics, now she's doing Ironman, so she's winning them at 41 years old. Wow. Women. So you know, and people kind of awesome. So, but she is someone who I look at and admire in consternation often and like puzzling as well, because she pushes her body to the absolute limit on a regular basis. I mean, absolute limit meaning like she can walk back home if she had to, but like it'd be really hard. And she does this over and over and over again. So some of this, like some of the emotional impetus for this book was really like trying to figure out why, and but also knowing that there is a sort of ecstasy in suffering sometimes too, right? I mean, I got this too with the medieval mystics that I studied in Matrix, where it's mixed, right? Ecstasy and suffering, and seeing God comes out of sort of the body, out of the body in some ways. So, and also my sister has this, like she kept telling me about this when sort of like a haunting of the book, but when she's really, really deep into a competition and it's really hard, right? She still has to run a whole marathon. She's already done like 4 hours of exercise. She goes into this thing called the pain cave. And the pain cave is the sort of this mental space where the deeper into the pain you go and you sort of imagine yourself going into it, the more the pain becomes its own thing that sort of speaks back to you, and so that you're able to deal with it. And in some ways, this book is a giant, right? Where you start to see through to the other side, and you start to be able to control it. It's kind of it's astonishing. I go for 4 miles a day. I run every day, but like yeah. So yeah, but also just a lot of research, right? To see what happens to the body under.
Yeah, so when I'm about halfway through the book, and what impressed me was your sense of direction. Like, I'm gonna walk out of here, I'm gonna have to put Google Maps on to get back to the hotel, you know what I mean? And it's just down the street because I'm so insecure about my sense of direction.
Yeah.
So you probably are not like that, but I mean, in a vaster wild for real, did you know like where she was going? And how did you map that in your mind?
Okay, well, first of all, I leave a mall and I go the wrong way. No direction to myself at all. But with this book, part of the like dark irony of the book is that she has no idea either, obviously.
Right.
Her mental map of the New World is so off. She has no idea how big it is. She had just vaguely knows the French are to the north and the Spanish are to the south. but because she comes from England, sort of, I think she thinks the scale is something like England scale, right? So she thinks it's, so, I mean, people at the time probably would have had more of a sense of direction because they didn't have ready access to their cell phones, right? Or even to compasses, so you just pay attention to the sun, where the sun is, and things like that. But she doesn't know where she's going, and in fact, you haven't gotten there yet.
No, I haven't. Yeah. You're writing like, I know, reading it, I'm like, I'll get to a point where I'm like, oh, okay. And then you surprise us.
Oh my gosh, so much. So the beautiful thing about going a book tour is that you're dislocated from your life and your soul. So I was just in, I really like floating above myself. I don't know, really just creating. But I was just in Houston and they had the Rockville Chapel there. And it's always like, I always go into it, I guess just watching the tour, right? Like, well, and then you stand in front of it and you're like weak and you sort of crumble inside because it's so like majestic and interesting. There are a bunch of Terrell installations too. I love so much. All the light sculptures, like installation. And he is one of those people who really somehow has access to the sub-language of humanity. I think the way that humans have surface language, I'm talking, but he can like feel the beat underneath things somehow and express them somehow. I don't know how great musicians do this as well, right? Dance can do this. I cry every time I see dance. I don't know why. I think it's just because it's seeing a human body push to go in it, right? Always. I cry when I see gymnastics or swimming, like anything. I just cry a lot. Yeah, I mean, England's been coming up recently. For some reason, I haven't been listening to a lot of music, but I need to change that because I reach feeling. You have suggestions? Hi.
So I read that you originally wrote this book in iambic pentameter in an early draft. I was wondering if you've ever done anything like that before, or what the impetus for that was here.
So first of all, she's wearing an Amherst college.
Yes.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
So we used to be Lady Jeffs, which is horrible, and then they changed the name. So it's not a lot better.
But I had Paul Rockwell and Judy Frank too, who I know you had, so I know you talked about those professors.
Yes,
Yeah.
Yeah. I voted for Lady Poets. Or no, Fighting Poets. No, Fighting Poets. Fighting Poets. Yeah. So yes, I did write a draft in IAMS. But I did it like 4 drafts in because I was so frustrated because the book was not congealing. Like I couldn't quite get it right. The research wasn't mixing with my daily practice of sitting down and writing. So I thought, what I'm going to do, I started as a poet. I was a very bad poet. But I really loved formal poetry because what I loved about it is it brings up ideas that you don't think that you have, right? Because the constraints of the form. So I was going to give myself the tightest form I could possibly have in order to sort of stir up things that I didn't know were in me or in the book itself. And so I said, I'm going to write a draft in IAMS. And it was so bad. But of course, I'm going for bad, right? I really want bad in the beginning. Because it just teaches, I'm just trying to learn about the book itself. And it really, like a draft, it was like a 2-week, I would sit down for 4 to 6 hours a day writing through this in IAMS and then like laugh at myself and go about my day and come back. So it wasn't like a good draft. It was like beginning and end, but that was about it. But it taught me so much, right? And I think sometimes when we get stuck, we really do need to break ourselves a little bit or break the book at hands and do something new, and knowing that it's probably not going to have anything direct that we're going to take out of it, but something really interesting and direct is going to come out of it. I'm like a breaker, a creative breaker. Like I like to build by breaking. Yeah. Which, yeah.
One more question.
Okay, great.
One more question. You also link.
Yes. There's another winner in here. Another too much pressure, I think.
Really technical. I know, and I've only just started the book, but for example, when you get into religious, fantasizing of the marriage or the way you, render that, you choose deliberately not to capitalize biblical references, unless I presume like Lot is capitalized, maybe let's not confuse with.
It's proper name.
Right, okay, but then like Sodom is not, God is not.
Places are not.
Right,
God is.
so what was behind that choice?
What do you think?
Well, I think you're trying to undermine the power of that.
Your own question.
Well, and I also with Sodom, I thought it, when you make it lowercase, it also becomes kind of a noun. You know, so it becomes like kind of
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for answering your question. All right, thank you, everyone.